All right, everybody. Welcome to Building SaaS on AWS. My name is Bill Tarr, and I am the AWS SaaS Factory. And as you can probably tell today, we have together with us John Topper. He is from the Scale Factory, not to be confused with the SaaS Factory. But on Building SaaS on AWS, every week we have experts like John on to talk to us about their journey and how they work with their customers on SaaS. So John, why don't I hand it over to you and you can give a quick introduction about who you are and what the Scale Factory is.
Sure, thanks, Bill. Good to be here. So I'm John Topper. I'm the founder and CEO of the Scale Factory. We're a AWS consulting partner. We're based out of the UK, and we work exclusively with SaaS businesses today. We've been around since 2009. There's 25 of us in total, so not a large team, but we punch above our weight, I think, in terms of the outcomes that we drive. So we've worked with customers that I guess on this stream viewers might recognise names like Sneak. Any viewers from the UK probably recognise ITV. We also work with a kind of long tail of I guess slightly more niche B2B SaaS businesses that you probably haven't necessarily heard of, but which underpin aspects of your daily life. We have some customers in the financial services sector, for example, who take care of information security for banking, email, and that sort of thing. So they're definitely out there, and we're out there keeping your data safe with them. But you may not have heard of them as businesses in of themselves. My background prior to this was in the ISP industry, so I kind of grew up in the world of the first internet bubble, where everybody who was designing things in print moved over to the web and were doing styling themselves as web designers, and we were selling Linux hosting packages to people who up until recently had been working in actual physical media of some sort. So that was an interesting experience. And then from then I went on into mobile application development in the days before the iPhone, which of course when the iPhone came out, it just revolutionized that whole industry to the point where our product wasn't necessary anymore, and so I founded the Scale Factory from there to work on, at that time, DevOps problems. I guess in 2009 we were just using the word DevOps for the first time, and we were helping customers build in data centers and on a sort of cheaper hosting providers. And then in about 2016, I think it was, we did our first AWS project, and that was it. We were hooked. AWS all the way. Since then, we now only work with AWS as a cloud provider, because life's too short to be expert at everything. Alongside my day job, I'm also an AWS ambassador, which is a term for a group of us who are employed by partners or partner organizations who are out in the world producing content and sort of active in the community. So we have a group of, I'm not sure how many of us now, actually something like 200 or 300. Looking forward to seeing some more of those faces at reInvent this year as well.
Great. All right. And John, today our topic is driving SaaS growth with compliance. And I know I think anyone who follows you on LinkedIn or Twitter knows that the Scale Factory is really big on compliance. You have your own compliance story. You work with customers on their compliance journeys. But I think it's really interesting that we've described SaaS growth as part of this topic. Instead of just talking about the journey to compliance, this is how you can achieve SaaS growth with compliance. So I heard you talk about fintech couple times as you were talking about your customer base, but maybe we can click into a couple of those customer stories first to talk about how compliance played a role and how the Scale Factory helped those customers achieve compliance.
Yeah, so the compliance stories can often be kind of seen as dull or a bit of an afterthought. It's certainly not
Right.
not the sort of thing that's really exciting to people. I think people are sort of excited by the idea of information security or cyber security as a whole, right up until they realize that what that involves is patching your machines regularly instead of wearing a black hoodie and red teaming. There's a lot of good practice required to get a good information security baseline, and only with that good practice can you demonstrate that you are meeting the standards of compliance regime. So things like ISO 27001, which is the standard that's pretty common in Europe and that my organization has as of fairly recently. But also SOC 2 in the US. Obviously, there are things like HIPAA and FedRAMP. There's a vast array of industry-specific standards. And when you're selling, if you're a SaaS business and you're selling your product to enterprise buyers, they have a lot of questions that they're asking you, and those questions will often form take the form of a huge pile of spreadsheet or a big stack of paperwork, asking a lot of different questions about how you use encryption at rest, how you secure your credentials, how you use 2FA, like all of the kind of like long tail questions about security. And typically, what those enterprises are asking are exactly the same questions as are covered by one of these security standards, so ISO 27001, SOC 2. And we find that SaaS businesses who attain one of these information security standards, one of these compliance standards, are more readily able to sell to those bigger businesses. And I think that on the journey from startup through to established business out there in the market making money, you start by throwing together a product as quickly as possible to prove the market and prove that what you think might be saleable is. And then you go out and get a funding round, and with that funding round, typically you're going to increase the size of your team, and you're going to go and increase the size of your sales team. A new sales team who's working on behalf of a SaaS company is going to go out and they're going to start knocking on the door of enterprise buyers because they spend more money, they churn less regularly, and so this is where a lot of the revenue for these kind of SaaS businesses will come from in the future. And if they don't have a plausible story around compliance and security for those buyers, then either the sales process will take a really long time because it becomes an exception process for the buyer rather than a standard kind of procurement process, which can work in the case of sweetheart deals where you know somebody at that organization, they're really rooting for you. But for the most part, if you in some cases those deals will just not turn out if you don't have those standards under your belt. So what we're really seeing is that SaaS businesses that invest in security and compliance can sell more quickly and can sell bigger deals and open up their market essentially. So in terms of how we've helped with this with our customer base, there's a vast number of the customers that we work with. They've been in that position. They've got a product working. They've got sales that aren't working out or that are moving too slowly, and they're looking for us to help them answer those questions about security. And typically how that works from a consulting perspective is that we'll go in and do probably something around a well-architected review or a sort of deeper security assessment of current practice. We'll identify gaps that exist in how they are thinking about security in their organization. And where those gaps exist, we seek to fill those gaps. And recently, so within the last 2 or 3 years, really the solution that we've been turning to most frequently has been AWS Control Tower, which builds good practice around account management and security of those accounts and governance of those accounts, both from a security and a cost perspective. And that gets a lot of the way through. If you're familiar with ISO 27001, there's a section of that standard called Annex A, which is a list of controls that you might want to consider using if you're building an information security management system under that standard. And I think we looked at the controls between Annex A and looked at Control Tower, and we think somewhere around half of those controls can be met in an AWS estate simply by deploying Control Tower and adopting it for use. So it's been really powerful for us, and I think we've deployed that something like 20, 30 times over the last couple of years for all manner of SaaS businesses in all kinds of business domains.
Absolutely. John, I mean, you already clicked on a couple of really important topics. You're talking about selling to enterprise customers and how your customers are coming to you and saying, listen, we've already got gaps. We're trying to sell to these customers and we can't do it without achieving compliance. And to me, that's the SaaS growth connection that you're making right there. But also the underlying technology and how we think about that. Now, I'm sure some people already caught a sneak peek of the eye chart that I had up in the beginning about Control Tower. So I'm going to bring that back up now, John. I know not everyone's going to be able to see the whole landscape here, John, but why don't you quickly talk us through this, and then we can dive into some of the details about what we're seeing here.
Yeah, sure. So Control Tower. I think if I were to position Control Tower for a viewer who is unfamiliar with it, I would say that it is the account management tooling that you probably would have hoped for from day one of your cloud journey. Really, right. It's now sort of readily available. It's being improved all the time, but it is a tool that makes it way easier for you to create cloud infrastructure and to allow your teams to self-service create their own cloud infrastructure, whilst also applying governance standards over the top of that. So what does that mean? Well, when you create an account with Control Tower, with the system baselines that account with a set of security standards that you can define. There's a lot of sensible defaults in Control Tower itself, but you can also augment those, which means that, for example, if you are a customer, like a really basic example from a compliance landscape, let's say there is a requirement that your data not leave Europe, for example. Right. And so it's important that any accounts that you create, none of the resources that are in those accounts are can be created in regions outside of Europe, and the system will control that for you and prevent that. On top of that, what you as a sort of a risk-aware security engineer want to be conscious of is that things like monitoring and logging and so forth is set up from day one, so that you can see what has happened in those accounts and go back and see who has made which changes and when, and for those logs and that audit trail to be non-changeable, right? Somebody can't go in and sort of cover their tracks after having done something bad, and so on and so forth. There's a number of these kind of good practices that relate to good infrastructure, and Control Tower, set up well, applies those to every account that's created in there. So on this eye chart here, for example, I guess the main thing to bear in mind with Control Tower is that although it is an AWS service with its own name and its own console and everything, what it's really doing is wrapping a lot of other services that have already existed within AWS. So things like GuardDuty, things like AWS config, things like service control policies, IAM policies, identity services, all that kind of stuff. It's all sort of wrapped up in this. So you'll see when we kind of get into the demo of this in the console, it's not very exciting to look at because really it's just a layer over the top of other services. But in this good practice account layouts that we're seeing on this diagram here, and this is how we set up Control Tower. So there are a few things in here that are default out of the box Control Tower decisions that you would get if you were to deploy this yourself. This is how we provision Control Tower for SaaS customers, because it contains a number of our opinions about how you should govern accounts for SaaS. We have, as a sort of starting point, a management account that contains the Control Tower deployment itself, which wraps AWS organizations for creating accounts. We integrate with SSO for identity. There are backup policies that are set up in there. And then there are a number of other accounts that get created as well, that are kept separate from that management account in order to reduce the risk of someone getting into one of those accounts and causing trouble. So we have an organizational unit under organizations for security related accounts, and we create a log archive account, which is the account where we're storing audit data that can't be messed with. We create an audit account for an audit team to be able to get in and look at what's running in other accounts if they've been given the privileges to do that. We also have an infrastructure OU that contains a bunch of shared services such as AWS chatbots, which is how we surface information from other services into Slack, for example, so that customers can see that where they work. There's a separate account for backups, separate security tooling account. So you can see with once you start adding all these accounts, you can imagine that it gets kind of complex to operate. Control Tower makes the operation of those multiple accounts way easier than it looks on the surface.
Right. Right. And yeah, John, just try to click through here. For anyone who's not familiar with Control Tower, you've mentioned that there's multiple accounts here. I also see OUs where you've organized those accounts into groupings. And is that sort of the high level of, I mean, we're also talking about AWS organizations here, I believe, as well, right? How do they sort of connect for anyone who's not familiar?
So yeah, organizational units. You can think of, if you're familiar with OUs in, say, identity directories like Active Directory. There's a similar concept. These are groupings of accounts or of other OUs where you can apply particular policies. And the OUs that are used by Control Tower are exactly the same OUs as you would use in AWS organizations. And so the what we're using OUs for here is grouping related accounts together so that we can apply security policies that affect all of those accounts. So in the security OU holds all of our security accounts. The infrastructure OU will hold all of our infrastructure accounts, so things like shared services and backups and so forth. And then we get into into workloads, and this is where OU design really kind of comes down to business need, if you like. We typically recommend against choosing organizational units to match how your business is set up. So you probably wouldn't have a separate OU for the finance department and the software development department and so forth. What we tend to recommend is that we have OUs that relate to non-production and production accounts, because those are likely to have different security requirements. And then below those OUs, we can create other groupings that might relate to specific types of services or particular business areas. And so the production OU is the place where you're going to have the most tight set of controls, because that's the infrastructure that you probably need to protect most carefully, because that's where your important data is. Whereas the non-production OUs might have a little bit more leeway. They might allow developer access where perhaps your production OUs don't. And those OUs then are used to aggregate those accounts together. And if you apply a service control policy, for example, which is a mechanism by which you can limit what happens inside those accounts, even by the root user, those service control policies will typically apply at the OU level, so that you can add an account to that OU and you pick up the same controls.
Yeah, absolutely, John. So, I mean, I know people have been staring at this eye chart and are probably like testing their eyes and glasses to see if they can read OUs, but let's click down another level. I think you have a couple more slides that dive into some of the detail of what we're seeing here. Then we'll look at a live demo of what this actually looks like in practice, right?
Sure, yeah. So I'm going to show to begin with, like the first slide here is an example of how we integrate the services that run in the security tooling account with services that run in the shared services account for notification. So you may be familiar with GuardDuty. For those who are not familiar with GuardDuty, GuardDuty is a machine learning backed service that looks for things that are weird in your AWS account, and it does that by looking at logs and API calls and other things like that. And based on what it knows to be normal for your account or for accounts in general, it'll report on something anomalous. So a great example of this, we were working with a fintech customer who building a payments platform, and they were working with a bank in Asia. They're based in London, and the CTO flew out to I can't remember where it was now, over in Asia to meet with his customer, and he logged into to his console. And GuardDuty immediately threw up an alarm saying, "Hey, Simon's just logged in, and he's logged in from Asia, and he doesn't usually do that. That might be an issue." So GuardDuty has all sorts of cool stuff like that.
Nice.
What these alerts are only useful if you're doing something about that, of course. And in the old days, Today in some larger organizations still, GuardDuty might sort of spit a ticket into a ticketing system, and some operations person might go and sort of rummage around in that. What we tend to find in our SaaS customers, they're a little smaller, a little more nimble than that. They're not very enterprisey at that point in time, and so they live in Slack. That's where they develop their software. Well, they communicate whilst they're developing their software, and they integrate all of their tooling with Slack so they can see what's going on. They're getting notifications from their build systems and so forth in there. So one regular ask is, can we get these alarms about what's going on our platform into Slack so that we can see them? Right. And so in the case of how we set this up around Control Tower, the security tooling account is where GuardDuty sits, and it sees everything that's going on in all the other accounts that are created. So as you create new accounts, this GuardDuty and the security tooling account becomes aware of them automatically as the account is created, without any sort of additional overhead or activity from your security team. And GuardDuty sits and waits for something weird to happen, and such as Simon's just logged in from Asia. It's going to pop an event onto an Amazon Event Bridge, which we've set up to pass all of these GuardDuty events into another event bridge that runs in our shared services account. And the reason we're doing that is to separate the security part of the equation from the services part of the equation. The security tooling account has quite a lot of access to things because it needs that in order to see what's going on. The shared services account is likely to be where you're running things like CI tools and those sorts of things. It's where, aside from in the kind of developer accounts, where your developers are most likely to be spending time. And so the GuardDuty alarms pass over this event bridge connection into the shared services account, where they're fanned out into SNS topics that relate to the region and the account that that alarm has come from. And we've got AWS chatbot sat in that shared services account, sat on as a global service, watching all of these SNS topics, which contain alerts then from GuardDuty across every region that you've got infrastructure deployed into. And chatbot then has a connection to Slack, and it's going to drop a message into Slack when something like that happens. So it sort of feels a little complicated, but really what we're doing when we're looking at security and compliance is we're trading off a little bit of complexity for safety. Right. And so keeping the security tooling account separate means that our security team, if they exist as a separate entity of people, only need access to that security tooling account or the audit account. And they don't need access to the shared services account, but the shared services account can still act on data that flows out of that security tooling account without direct access to that itself. Right. And so our developers can see what's going on in there.
So John, I mean, thinking about this in terms of what we were talking about Control Tower. So this isn't pure Control Tower out of the box. This is a customized flow that your team has built to enable the Slack flow for your customers. But, is GuardDuty, does that come turned on out of the box with Control Tower? What's sort of the line between what standard Control Tower is and the additions you guys have built onto it here?
Yeah, I mean, that line's become blurred over time, actually. I'm not actually sure I can answer that directly, but okay. But certainly GuardDuty is I think one of the things that Control Tower will turn on by default. Right. There are other controls that are available in there that are around AWS config rules, service control policies, and cloud formation guard functions right. that are all sort of served to limit the damage that someone can cause, essentially, within the bounds of the requirements of a business. So we can talk a bit more about how those controls look when we dive into the console. Yeah. Now might be a good time to do that. I think that I do have other deeper details about each of the OUs and the things that live in there, but I think the console experience is probably the best place to go next, so I can illustrate what we've just talked about, but in the console itself. So.
Yeah, let's jump over there and actually look at the live demo that you prepared. I think it's a great time to do that.
Yeah. So again, caveat: Control Tower is not exciting to look at. It's not like Bedrock or something like that, where there's a sort of really kind of cool outcome that you can kind of look at and point at and go awesome. So that as I say, Control Tower is really a sort of layer over the top of other services. So you'll see as we go through this, we'll be jumping into other parts of the console that relate to the bits of Control Tower we're looking at. So this is the dashboard, and again, I'm going to caveat this by saying this is our test account where we used to develop on our Control Tower solution. As a result, as all test accounts are, there's some cruft in there. There's some sort of you'll see some errors and whatnot. But rest assured, in production, this thing all works pretty flawlessly. So in our Control Tower layout, we have 13 OUs in total. These are the organizational units we talked about, covering 19 accounts, and that's a fairly low number of accounts. I think the customers that we use this with probably have way more than that. They might have accounts per tenant, for example. They might have an account per developer to kind of work on their sort of sandbox environment. So typically you'll see this number bigger than this. But Control Tower is functional up to hundreds of accounts. It doesn't have any kind of scale issue, certainly in the way that we've seen it used. Within this Control Tower, you can see this summary of enabled controls, and these are spread across preventive, detective, and proactive controls. And these are the things that really underpin a compliance position. These are, when we talk about controls, we're talking about either things that are stopping certain configuration choices from being made, or telling us if they have been made, one or the other.
Right.
So a preventive control is typically implemented as a service control policy, which, if you're unfamiliar with those, they're a little like IAM rules, but they apply to the account level as a whole, and they also apply to the root user. So if you've got people in your organization who have root access to any of their accounts, and I wouldn't recommend that for a number of reasons, they still can't do things that you've prevented with one of these preventive controls. So that might be disallowing the creation of resources in Bahrain. It might be preventing anyone setting up an enormous Redshift cluster using quadruple XL large instances that are going to cause your CFO to have a heart attack when the bill arrives. So we might be governing cost as well as security, I guess is my point. But but out of the box, the SCPs are typically, the preventive controls are mostly worried about security, and this is sort of stopping you doing things like creating subnets in public networks and that sort of thing.
And John, these controls that we're looking at, are these again a blend between ones that come out of the box with Control Towers and one that your team has created?
So mostly, I would say that the controls that we apply in our base Control Tower deployment are the ones that Control Tower provide out of the box. There are a number to choose from, so you have to kind of curate your selection, really, and it depends which compliance regimes you're following as to which of those you might choose. Within Security Hub, for example, there are sort of controls that relate to the NIST standard or the CIS benchmark or PCI DSS, and so you might pick and choose from those in your own environment. Where you sort of think about adding preventive controls on a per customer basis, that might be those things like the Redshift problem. If you've got a customer who's really reliant on enormous Redshift clusters, obviously you don't want to be preventing them from creating those. But you might want to, as a sort of starting point, look at the infrastructure you're likely to be using and just turn off access to everything else. Why enable contact center? If this customer isn't going to be thinking about running a Connect setup, there's no need to do that. So locking it down to the fullest extent is the safest bet. But again, you're trading off the sort of convenience to the security and the governance. In some cases, you might be the sort of size of organization where it's okay for someone to be spinning up these things and trying them out. You don't want them opening tickets and sort of bothering the security team to allow that to happen. It's really a kind of really a choice in your organization. But part of what we do when we configure Control Tower for customers is we have a workshop session that we start with, and we sit down for a day with the customer, understand their business and their requirements, what kind of compliance obligations they have, and help them think about the controls that they're likely to need in their own organization as a result of that.
It's an interesting point you brought up along the way there, John, too, that having an understanding of what compliance frameworks or regulations you're trying to get to are important at the beginning of your journey. So you have to anticipate to some extent and think about what customers who are and what they're going to ask for compliance frameworks from you.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, we haven't been exposed in depth to all compliance frameworks, but from the kind of 10,000 foot view, all compliance frameworks are about keep the data in, don't let the bad guys in, and they're really just a different ways of saying the same thing. And so the sort of the starting point for most of these things is pretty consistent, right? You're talking about encryption at rest, you're talking about 2FA, you're talking about least privilege access, you're talking about logging and audit trails, and that sort of thing. But the things that those are called in a different regulatory environment sort of look at different things. And the AWS product landscape has started sort of considering that now, which is kind of interesting. We might not sure if we'll see in this view. Some of the controls, as you look at them in other parts of the console, have a control objective, and the objective is the thing that is consistent across standards, and then the controls that exist all sort of break down under that objective. So if you have a control about encryption at rest, there'll be a load of controls around preventing you from setting up resources that don't have encryption at rest across all the different services. You'll have config rules for looking for services that have been configured without encryption at rest enabled, and so forth. And there'll be sort of dozens of these under one control objective. But under a framework, you might have sort of 20 or 30 control objectives that are all going to be consistent across different frameworks, in fact, because most of them are concerned with the same things, just with different nomenclature.
Nice. And so now we're looking at some non-compliant resources here, John. So what mistakes have we made in our accounts here?
So this is where we're breaking the rules. I can see that Andrew here has assigned a subnet a public IP address, which he probably shouldn't have done. And we've got public write access enabled for our log archive account, which isn't what we want at all. So if we dive into this, we can sort of see this is within Control Tower interface still. You can see on the details here. It's a detective control. We already saw that. So this is something which is looking for resources that have been configured like this. So nothing. Well, it's possible that there are other controls that prevent this from happening, but in case those have been turned on after someone has created the resource in a way that isn't consistent with this control, we're reporting on it as well. And it is implemented as an AWS config rule. And so it is something that runs as part of config, which is, again, its own distinct AWS service. In fact, if you're deploying Control Tower, the application of config rules is where some of the cost comes from when you're deploying it. Control Tower itself is a free service, but you do accrue some cost as a result of some of the things it sets up for you. And config rules is one of those things. In fact, we've had some customers ask us to turn off some number of config rules that almost certainly will never apply to them, just because those rules are firing periodically and increasing their bill reasonably substantially throughout the month. So you have to be slightly careful with what you turn on here. And you can see that the control owner here is AWS Control Tower. So actually this config rule has been created by Control Tower. It doesn't belong to any of the other services. And the control objective, here's what I mentioned before. The control objective here is about enforcing least privilege. So this is a control that is detecting public write access setting for a log archive. It is important that most people are not allowed to write to the log archive. In fact, the only thing you want writing to the log archive really is the service that is aggregating logs from elsewhere. And so enforce least privilege, sort of that control objective encapsulates a whole bunch of other controls, both detective, preventive, and proactive across all those different services as well. And you
John,
see here in the framework,
the frameworks.
we cover
I just noticed that.
Yeah. So the CIS benchmark, the NIST framework, and PCI DSS all require you to be not tampering with logs, basically, which is a perfectly reasonable thing for it to be wanted to see. And so that if you enable the controls for that framework in Security Hub, it will enable this config rule as well as a whole bunch of other things. And this is a critical severity bug as well. So if you were looking at a dashboard of things to remediate, you would probably order by severity, and you would look at this and go, yeah, okay, we should probably deal with that, because actually, if log tampering is possible, all the rest of our security controls are completely out the window. We couldn't prove that someone hasn't done a bad thing and then cover their tracks. So we definitely need to get on top of that. So that's a control there. You also, in the control tower view, you get an artifact for each of the controls, which is how that control is implemented, essentially. So here, the AWS config rule that relates to this, you can pop that up and you can look at it in CloudFormation terms, and you can kind of look at that and go, well, what does that do? And if you understand how to read AWS config rules, this will all make a whole bunch of sense. And there are dozens of these for all sorts of use cases. If we wanted to look at the other least privilege controls, for example, so there are 65 of them, and these are, as you can see, they relate to all the services in turn. Several for EC2, obviously, because that's the place where you'll most likely shoot yourself in the foot. There are proactive controls here as well, which are implemented as CloudFormation guard rules, which are reasonably recent additions to CloudFormation. And these are rules that will fire as you try and apply your CloudFormation. They'll say, actually, here is an error, user. You can't do that because this rule says that you're not allowed to. And as you can see here, this control is from November last year, so fairly recently put in the thing.
And I don't know what you mean about this not being sexy. Control Tower clearly has, like, this is a gorgeous UI. So
it's just a big pile of tables.
But and they're great, right? It's a ton of information. Yeah. But you did mention along the way this idea that you might have dashboards that explain some of the alerts that you might see. I know those might pop up in other services. I was thinking about these controls and how do I see what's compliant and what's not? Might I be going to other services to look at some dashboards?
So Control Tower is surfacing some of this. So the way that we sort of bounced into those controls was via this list of non-compliant resources, which is surfaced in Control Tower. If you were using Security Hub, we haven't set up Security Hub explicitly with this, then you would see the things that were the controls that were part of Security Hub that Control Tower has deployed alongside all the other things that you set up in Security Hub, So Security Hub predates Control Tower by 2 or 3 years, maybe more than that, in fact. And so that was the place where you would get your cross-account view of security setup, essentially, across your estate. Control Tower is now surfacing that as well. I think there's definitely scope for confusion here if you're sort of new to this. I think we've obviously deployed a lot of Control Tower, so we know this inside and out. But I think if I put my kind of partner hat on and my ambassador hat on, setting this up is really a great engagement for a partner, because you will do this once as an organization. You're going to set up Control Tower a single time. You will obviously continue to sort of iterate on the settings and so forth. So it's important to understand bits of it, but getting your head around the whole thing is sort of there's not a lot of point investing that learning for a team for the most part. So getting a consultancy in like us to sort of set this up with good practice and to know where the decision points are and kind of guide you through it, I think is a really good thing to do. That's my sales pitch for today, I guess. Is don't try and do this yourself. It'll confuse the hell out of you. It is quite complicated.
I just to chime in on that, John, it's an interesting point. There are services you want to learn. Like everyone should get to know DynamoDB. They should get to know S3 because you're going to use them over and over again. Control Tower, yes, you'll continue to use it, but you're probably going to set it up once. How much effort do you want to put into learning all of the best practices for setting up a Control Tower for SaaS, right?
And most people in your organization will never see Control Tower itself. So as you've got this sort of set up, we have this thing called an account factory over here, which is how you create new accounts that inherit the security baselines and the configs that come out of Control Tower. And so on a sort of per development team basis or a developer basis, it's fairly likely that that you'll come and talk to someone who's been involved in setting up Control Tower and say, "Can I have an account, please?" Or possibly you create something that calls the Service Catalog API to get one vended for you, and thereafter it's all set up like all of these all of the sort of GuardDuty config, the log aggregation, the service control policies, all the rules as a sort of day-to-day developer in this platform. Those are the things that act as guardrails to make sure that you're not doing anything potentially damaging or expensive, but you're very unlikely to yourself be spending any time in the Control Tower setup or console. Plus, a lot of the things that go on in Control Tower are the classic AWS term, right? They're undifferentiated heavy lifting. A Control Tower setup for one SaaS business really looks an awful lot like a Control Tower setup for another, which is what allows us to kind of build a standard version of this as a starting point for customers and sort of work on things from there. So a lot of teams predating Control Tower who've been using AWS for more than 3, 4, 5 years will probably a team that's practicing well at least will have set up quite a lot of maybe Terraform or other infrastructure as code config to do some of the things that Control Tower does today. I would argue that that new teams shouldn't be doing that at all. Like if you're setting up a good practice AWS landing zone from today onwards, if you're writing any infrastructure as code that isn't part of Control Tower, I think that's a waste of time, because it does so much for you and it's constantly evolving. There's, I think if we look in the settings for Control Tower, in the landing zone settings, there's this whole list of historical versions that we've been through, since release in November 2018. It's longer ago than I remember, actually. We've been doing this for 2 or 3 years, but I guess it's been around for 5, or coming on for 5. Each of these new versions added a bunch of additional support, all of which was useful and broadly undifferentiated. And so as new versions of this become available, what you're doing is saying, I'd like this one, please, update it. You can't downgrade, which is why that button's grayed out right now. But every time you bump a version, you get the good stuff that some AWS engineers somewhere have developed that you haven't had to spend any time thinking about. And that's the power of SaaS as a whole, but as the power of adopting services provided by your cloud vendor, which I think if you're adopting a cloud for your platform, you should be handing over as much of the sort of grunt work operations of things to that vendor to take care of for you, because this stuff it's not sexy, and it's also none of my customers care about how their accounts are governed. They just want to know that they're governed well. So it's not a differentiator to be doing this with Terraform or Pulumi or whatever.
Absolutely. Now, John, from the beginning, we've been talking about compliance and how it drives SaaS growth. So are we talking a lot about Control Tower? You mentioned about 50% of the controls apply to getting ISO 27001 or SOC 2 or those baseline. But in terms of the rest of the journey, how do those connect in? So I'm a new customer, you set up Control Tower for me. What's the rest of that 50% of the journey that you would take me on to get me to the compliance frameworks I need?
Yeah, good question. So 27001, it's about identifying information security risks and mitigating them. And so so some of that journey is about how you as an organization evaluate risk and prioritize dealing with it. And within any kind of business, when we talk about information, as far as information security is concerned, we're not just talking about our customers' data. We're also talking about information we have about our staff, payroll data, the DBS checks that we have to validate to our customers that our staff are safe pairs of hands, all of that kind of stuff. And so your AWS account is only part of the journey. It's an important one, and certainly if you're thinking about communicating your competence at managing risk to your customers, that's the bit that they're going to care about because that's where their data is. But it also applies to how are you managing end user devices, how are you securing your office. We don't have a physical office, so we're able to kind of take all of that entirely out of the picture, which is quite useful. Right. But there's a lot more there. So the 50% that is there probably is all about encryption at rest and audit trails and backups and monitoring, all the good things that you get with a control tower deployment. But you're also thinking about identity management. You're thinking about how are we mitigating risks on phones and laptops and that sort of thing. And it's also about building your information security management system, which is the central point in how you are thinking about and categorizing your risks. We partner with an organization called Vanta, who are a vendor of SaaS software to run an information security management system, and out of the box, Vanta has a number of example policies that you can work from, because there's a lot of policy work in there and sort of training your team and that sort of thing. There's also Vanta has the ability to hook into your AWS account and report back. So when your auditor comes to have a look at how you're doing versus the controls that you've defined for yourself, and this is Vanta covers SOC 2 as well as ISO 27001. They can look at a dashboard and see if there's a bunch of green, that actually Vanta as a tool has suck that data out of your AWS estate and is validating that you are following the rules that you've set for yourself. So if you're starting from scratch with 27001, or if you're, I guess, less than 25% of the way through it, thinking about something like Vanta is a great addition to that story, because it does make life a little quicker and easier, because there is a lot of boilerplate in these kinds of compliance standards, right. And so you can benefit from other people's provision of that boilerplate, essentially.
I mean, you said before undifferentiated heavy lifting. So compliance as a service, we've really seen that emerge as a trend over the last couple of years. So, use a partner, get control tower set up, get all of the best practices in place, go through the well-architected, make sure that you've got the best practices. And then by the time you turn on that compliance as a service provider, you may be 50% of the way there and you've got some more work to do. Yeah, that actually, it makes a lot of sense in terms of the journey for sure.
Yeah.
So is there anything else here you wanted to click through and show us in Control Tower, John?
I think that pretty much everything here that I've shown you in the console are the things that we talked about before we opened the console, but just as one additional thing I want to show you in the account factory, because this is, for me, one of the things that relates Control Tower really readily to SaaS specifically. I think what we've talked about today is quite general. You would benefit from adopting this approach even if you're not a SaaS business today. There's where it applies to SaaS directly. Let's ignore that error. In the account factory, there's the ability to customize things that you're creating. So the account factory in Control Tower is a direct analog, or in fact interfaces directly with Service Catalog. So if you're unfamiliar with Service Catalog allows you to define products inside your AWS estate, whether that's provision of users in a certain way or other resources. And in a sort of larger enterprise organization, you could imagine, for example, a pre-blessed deployment of, let's say, EKS, a Kubernetes platform, right? And a team central to the organization creates a blueprint for how this organization runs Kubernetes, right. And codifies that into Service Catalog, such that when a new customer comes along, or a new business unit comes along and says, we're crazy, let's use Kubernetes because we have far too much time on our hands, they can go and click somewhere in a console and get an account that's got a Kubernetes vended into it, or vend a Kubernetes into an existing account, and all that's through sort of Service Catalog, which sort of takes care of the orchestration of that and the provisioning of it. In the Control Tower account factory world, when you create a new account, that is a service catalog entry. Right? It's a Control Tower governed AWS account product. But also within Control Tower, you can use this account factory customization set of settings. I can't show you an example because we don't have one set up right now. But you can add a product from Service Catalog to that account as you create it. And that's interesting from a SaaS perspective because when we're building SaaS, we have a number of different options for tenancy models. And one tenancy model, particularly popular in the B2B landscape, where everyone is really paranoid about their data being shared by other people, is the silo tenancy model, which is where you create an entirely unique set of infrastructure for that particular tenant. So some of our bigger customers, actually some of our smaller customers as well, are all doing this for their buyers, because their buyers are big, spending a lot of money, and their data is really, really important. So what they're doing is vending out an account per tenant. What you can do is use Service Catalog to define what does an account with my application running in it look like, and use that along with Control Tower to create those siloed accounts as new tenants buy from you, essentially. So you can imagine if you're thinking about building your SaaS control plane, which is handling kind of provisioning new resources as and when customers pay for them. Maybe you hook it up with the AWS Marketplace, for example. The process for creating that account for that new tenant can entirely be automated by using this approach here, where a new account is created by Control Tower. It's baselines to your security standard before anything else happens, before any identity services are set up and anybody can log into it. So you can be confident that that's all there. And then the Service Catalog product for your SaaS resources get vended also into that account. You've got something in your control plane that's watching the events that Control Tower emits as these things are being created. And when that account has been created, then move on to the next step and send the customer details for how to log in. So really kind of very sort of clear SaaS use case there for Control Tower, and a reassuring story from an auditability perspective for the people who are buying from you, such that you could prove that once they bought that. If you had an auditor from that business come in and say, "Show me how you set this up," you just go and point at all the logs of that happening, and how those accounts were created and how those resources were created before anybody could get into them. And once people could get into them, they were prevented from doing uncouth or dangerous things by the control policies that you've put in place. So really, really good compliance story there for SaaS business.
Nice. All right. Well, we're coming into the last 10 minutes here. So let's get out of the Control Tower screen for a minute.
For sure.
Everyone's going to give their eyes a rest of trying to read all of these tables that we have up in Control Tower. There was one thing I heard you mention as you were talking about at the end there, and that was AWS Marketplace. Yes. Now, I think a lot of people eventually who are building SaaS products want to list on Marketplace, but I'm not sure if everyone realized some of the qualifications it takes to list on Marketplace, like a foundational technical review, for example, and how those play into what we've been talking about today. Do you want to quickly talk about that and what you guys do for your customers trying to list on Marketplace?
Yeah, so Marketplace, you can list a product on Marketplace without it being reviewed, as I understand it. But Marketplace is essentially a central location, a shopping, like a shop front, if you like, for buying services built by AWS partners. And so Sneak, for example, a customer that I mentioned earlier, we were involved in their GCP to AWS migration. They published a case study with AWS recently that talked about their, I think, 14 times return on investment for getting into Marketplace with their product. A really clear use case for them. They're a security vendor, so they're selling to developers like us, essentially. And Marketplace is a great way of distributing their product. The sort of key thing with Marketplace is that if you are a younger, less well-known SaaS organization, it can be difficult to get onto the procurement and buying frameworks that your customers are using. And by selling through Marketplace, that customer is essentially buying from AWS services that you provide. Obviously, you give away some margin, and there's a little bit of complexity and sort of paperwork to do in that regard, but it can open up deals that will otherwise not be available to you. Today, Marketplace isn't a great way of discovering new products or for buyers to sort of find what you're doing, but if you've got a relationship with the customer that you're trying to sell to, you can point at Marketplace and say, hey, you can buy from this. Other kind of bit of trivia around Marketplace, if you are if your enterprise customer has an EDP, an enterprise discount with AWS, then spend on Marketplace counts to the quota that you've agreed with an EDP. So if you don't know what an EDP is, don't worry about it. But if you do know what an EDP is, you'll know why that's important.
Right.
So Marketplace spend counting to EDP is a pretty good thing. If you want to do joint go-to-market activities with AWS and you want to get a sort of a badge that demonstrates that you have been adequately assessed, you're a sort of certified solution, then you do need to have some form of review, and that review is called a foundational technical review, which has overlap with well architected in that it's concerned with a lot of the same sorts of things. It's a test of good practice. One of those tests of good practice is, are you doing security particularly well? And so if you are a recipient of a Scale Factory deployed Control Tower deployment for SaaS, well, the answer is yes. That's very easy, tick in the box. But there are other things in there as well. Once you've passed an FTR, you are eligible to join something called the ISV Accelerate program, which is an AWS program that has various sort of go-to-market and funding opportunities aligned with it. So if you are an AWS partner because you are hoping to drive sales through that channel, then you will want to be on the ISV Accelerate program. If you want to be on the ISV Accelerate program, you will need an FTR, and if you need an FTR, a partner like the Scale Factory can run those for you. And combined with well architected, if your FTR does uncover issues that need remediating, now the bar is reasonably high for an FTR. You do need to not be carrying security risks. Then well-architected partners like us have access to funding programs that can help cover the cost of figuring out remediating some of those security issues. So definitely another example of a thing where working with a partner is a good idea, because there's funding available as well as expertise.
Nice. Now, John, I'm sure people have enjoyed listening to you over the last hour, but is there any upcoming opportunities where they could actually meet you in person or have a conversation with you more about these topics?
Yep. If you're not sick of hearing from me yet, which I do get out there quite often, and I've been hosting the AWS User Group UK for a few years, and while we were in lockdown, that was on Twitch like this. So I think that there may be people on the stream now who've joined from that. But on the 18th of September, there's an event in London called AWS on Tour, which is being organised by the DevRel folk from AWS. They are working their way around Europe. I believe Gunnar from this show has three cities he's visiting. London isn't one of them, but I will be there on the 18th. Not necessarily for the whole day, but in the evening we are running as the AWS User Group UK, which is actually the London user group, as the people from other user groups in the UK will keep reminding me. We're running a networking event in the evening. There'll be sort of up to 200 people there. It's going to be at AWS or Amazon's Fenchurch Street offices. So that's worth checking out. We also we've got other events coming up with the user group. On the 18th of October, we're doing another in-person meetup. I don't think we've booked our speakers for that yet. If you are someone who likes to get up on stage and talk about AWS things, we do have a CFP open if you'd like to find that. I also run a meetup group for the CTOs of SaaS businesses. We call it the SaaS CTO Network, because we're better at naming things than AWS is, and we tend to talk strategy more than technology for the most part. It's kind of open it's open to CTOs, but also people on the journey towards being a CTO. So you kind of VP engineering, kind of technical decision makers. We've got about 340 members on that list so far, and we do online roundtables. We have some webinars that happen. We do in-person meetups as well. So if you are the CTO of a SaaS business, we'd love to have you in that network, and I will drop a link to that into the Twitch chat, unless Anthony's done that already. No, he's done that already. It's a ninja. Well done, Anthony.
All right, with that, John, I'm going to wrap it up. I think we're going to see you at reInvent as well, right? If I'm not mistaken.
You are going to see me at reInvent, yes.
Right on.
Flights willing, I will be around. So if anybody would like to see me at reInvent, the reInvent app, event app, has a functionality called Peer Talk, which first debuted last year. I should be listed on there as one of the ambassadors in Peer Talk. So if you'd like to get together and talk about Control Tower or SaaS or anything of that nature, do get in touch.
Thank you very much, John. And with that, I'll say thanks for coming and look forward to see you at reInvent, if not sooner. Take care, John.
Likewise. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you, everybody.